situation was exacerbated because they made a roadless rule, Clinton did right after this, and they started burning larger areas on purpose, saying it was a beneficial aspect to the environment, and global warming was what was causing these increases in fire. It wasn't anything to do with poor land management policies, which were actually at the root of these problems, and still is at the root of these problems.
This is Climate Debrief, brought to you by the CO2 Coalition. I'm Angela Wheeler. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Bob Zybach, a PhD environmental scientist, historian, writer, researcher, and photographer with deep roots in Oregon's forests. Dr. Zybach earned his PhD in environmental sciences from Oregon State University in 2003, with a bachelor's in forest recreation, a master's in oral histories, and his doctorate as a historical ecologist. He also ran a successful reforestation business in Oregon for 20 years. Dr. Zybach's expertise centers on forests and fire history, reforestation planning, endangered species habitat, and the long-term impacts of land management policies. He's the program manager of the Oregon Websites and Watersheds Project and a valued member of the CO2 Coalition. He is also the editor of the National Wildfire Alliance newsletter. Dr. Zybach's work challenges conventional narratives by grounding today's wildfire and forest challenges in historical evidence and on-the-ground experience. Dr. Zybach, welcome to Climate Debrief. Thank you so much for lending your expertise to our audience.
Well, thank you, Angela. It's good to be here.
Dr. Zybach, your 500-year study on wildfire in Western Oregon and your PhD research comparing modern patterns to historical Indian burning practices offer such valuable perspective. What key insights from that work most inform how we should approach forest management today?
Well, the Indian burning practices burned millions of acres of land a year. Along ridgelines and riparian areas, they maintained large fields, sometimes millions of acres of tarweed or hundreds of acres of camas or oak savanna. And these are what we call natural fuel breaks now. We don't understand that these were created by people and maintained by people that expertly use fire for centuries, for millennia. So the removal of those areas through afforestation, the invasion of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir has created a situation with significantly more fuel on the ground than has ever existed before. So with recent policy changes, not allowing active management of those fuels as the Indians did, as the loggers did, as people that ran grazing animals did for generations, has resulted in a huge fuel buildup, and we're now having catastrophic wildfires at an unprecedented rate. This picture was taken, this is when this should have ended. This is the B&B complex fire. It occurred in 2002. I had just got my PhD at that time, so I was studying the fire. This footprint was directly in line with a beetle kill, about 80 or 90,000 acres in the early 1990s, and myself and others said, if these fuels aren't removed, we're going to have a catastrophic wildfire. And they weren't removed, and we had a catastrophic wildfire. The problem then became, this is also a cover of one of my anthologies. I've been writing articles for 40 years, so I've been gathering them in anthologies, mostly for my great-grandkids. But the situation was exacerbated because they made a roadless rule, Clinton did right after this, and they started burning larger areas on purpose, saying it was a beneficial aspect to the environment, and global warming was what was causing these increases in fire. It wasn't anything to do with poor land management policies, which were actually at the root of these problems, and still is at the root of these problems. This is the Elliott State Forest. It burnt most recently in 1886, but there's a record of fires, regular fires from the 1600s to the late 1800s. So it filled in with second growth. It was given to the school trust lands and then managed 400 jobs and tens of millions of dollars towards schools by federal agreement. And then recently, the environmental community said that logging was bad and that sequestering carbon would change the environment. So this is a area in which you've got to call them elites. The Democrat government here in Oregon decided that rather than having 400 jobs and millions to our schools, it would be better to not log and thereby somehow affect the climate. And that's being challenged in court now, but it's been a very expensive side trip on a wonderful forest land. This is a graph showing what we just looked at, the Elliott State Forest. In 1990, the vertical red line down the middle shows when the spotted owl was created as an endangered species. The green line across the top shows about 50 million or 75 million feet of timber. That's how much grows in the Elliott every year. The yellow line shows the average that was established in the late 80s as being a very conservative harvest level, 50 million feet a year. So there'd be growing 25 million feet more than it was being harvested. But all the red lines that go down to zero to the right of the vertical red line, those are rulings by the court, litigation based on regulations that say that logging is bad for the spotted owl, and therefore we have to stop doing it, and we have to start raising carbon credits for climate change instead. So that's heading towards another catastrophic wildfire, very much like the picture we just looked at.
In your presentation, you showed that the dramatic drop in timber sales in Elliott State Forest and the rise in wildfire acreage since the 1990s. What practical policy changes would you recommend to reduce litigation barriers and restore active management while prioritizing community benefits?
Practical policy would be to actually eliminate some of the government regulations, arbitrary regulations. They've got all kinds of acronyms, HCP, Habitat Conservation Plan, in which you can't actively manage trees that are within 75 feet or 62 feet or whatever the model tells them. And so you have fuels build up because of that. What would be needed would be a restoration of the previous law and practices, which worked fine without fire, which produced 400 jobs and millions of dollars in very safe wildlife habitat, clean water, clean air from lack of burning, and so on. So a restoration of active management, but using more enlightened approaches would be something that could be implemented almost immediately. Just by eliminating some of the regulations and the capability of the environmental movement to file litigation.
Dr. Zybach, you highlighted the contrast between rapid recovery after events like the 1910 Windling Fire and the 1962 Columbus Day storm versus today's delays. How can we restore incentives for quick, responsible salvage logging and reforestation?
I don't think it's a matter of restoring incentives. I think it's a matter of eliminating onerous regulations. When Windling burned, it was on private property, but within 90 days, something like 38 homes and the bowling alley and the jail and the market all burnt. I don't know if I have the right buildings in order there, but only about 2 homes were saved. They didn't have indoor plumbing when it burnt, but 90 days later, and certainly within a year, the entire community had been rebuilt. Homes were now larger. They now had indoor plumbing because it was 1910. All of the businesses were returned, and people continued working the entire time. On the Columbus Day storm, that was a Friday afternoon. I was in high school. I was actually flying a kite until the trees started uprooting. We blew down 11 billion feet in Northern California, Western Oregon, and Southwest Washington. That was on a Friday evening. By Monday, 72 hours later, Bill Hagenstein, who became a friend later in life, and other dignitaries and owners of businesses had gotten together over the weekend, and within 72 hours, they were salvaging the blowdown and repairing the roads. So it was a decision of people that were experienced land managers that knew what they were doing, that were responding to an emergency. Now we have Los Angeles as a good example of government intervention, keeping a community from rebuilding. We've got the same thing in Oregon with the Blue River. That town burnt down 5 years ago. Less than 50% of it has been rebuilt. We have lands that burnt 10 and 20 years ago that are now reburning because they were theoretically left in place to provide habitat. The people that were worried about carbon don't seem to be worried about wildfires or rotting logs. So now we're at an inertia where regulations and litigation, both of them engineered by environmental law profession, have slowed everything down and added enormous cost in both time and dollars to any kind of restoration effort. And it's taking years and sometimes not even being completed now to even begin rebuilding.
In your April 2022 article for the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Journal, entitled Global Warming and Oregon Wildfires Part 2, History Repeats Itself Again, you documented over 30 years of accurate predictions about large wildfires in western Oregon, showing they were driven by changes in federal forest management rather than global warming. What stands out most to you now about how those earlier warnings have played out, and what lessons from that history should we apply today?
The predictions I was making were in the front page of a national magazine in 1994. I said if we adopt these passive management policies, which we've adopted on our forests, on our national forests, we would have catastrophic wildfires. Since then, we started having catastrophic wildfires, and the result has been that after 4 or 5 years, the people that were talking about preserving our forests, saving our old growth, spotted owl habitat, changed their tune and said, oh, it's global warming, our models are correct, it's just that now fire is beneficial to the environment, the global warming is causing these fires to increase, and that's been going on for about 20 years. They've been able to get away with that argument. With the result, we've had record amounts of catastrophic wildfires in western Oregon, northern California, most of the western United States, New Mexico, that were predicted by myself and others 30 years ago. But the result in our cases, and I can name some scientists and so on, Chad Oliver would be one from University of Washington, Pilkey would be another one, we got canceled. So for 20 years, arguing that this is not a global warming problem, this is a federal policy problem, this is a litigation problem, has resulted in being avoided and ignored rather than listened to. But now, in the last 2 or 3 years with the new administration, it looks like they're finally putting the global warming rationale to rest. It's never been a factor. And they are starting to pay attention to the fact that we've been mismanaging our forests, and we need to, again, begin active management again.
You've noted that while climate has varied over centuries, politics and management decisions are driving much of today's wildfire challenges. How does distinguishing these factors help us focus on actionable solutions?
Very clear. So actionable solutions would be to re-examine some of the NEPA doctrine that were put in 1969. The Spotted Owl Wildlife Endangered Species Act changes that were put in 1973, and then mostly in 1980, Equal Access to Justice Act said that environmental organizations could sue the government based on regulations from the Endangered Species Act and from NEPA to halt logging or things that were determined to be detrimental to the environment. So looking closely at those regulations, Equal Access to Justice Act was intended for veterans, for poor people, for small businesses, but it got hijacked by Sierra Club and Cascadia Wild and other organizations. What it means is that when they file suit against the federal government and prevail, U.S. taxpayers have to pay enormous rates to the lawyers, sometimes 3 and 4 and 5 times what they actually charge professionally, hundreds of dollars an hour, have to pay damages to these organizations. And meantime, with their actions, they've put hundreds of people out of work, and they've cost our schools and roads millions of dollars. And this has been pretty much an invisible process. So it's not an accident. In December of 1969, within 24 hours, while Congress, who was 60% lawyers, was voting National Environmental Protection Act, within 24 hours and within 50 miles, 50 lawyers were incorporating the Environmental Law Institute, ELI. And since that point, they've worked hand in glove to reorganize the Endangered Species Act and to implement Equal Access to Justice Act, and they've been incredibly successful in stopping logging and promulgating these wildfires without taking responsibility so far. But that's the one thing that could be done fairly quickly, fairly easily. The president could declare a national emergency, which is what we're experiencing, to bypass these laws temporarily, but they need to be re-examined because they've been detrimental to our communities and to our nation and to the air.
This concludes part 1 of my interview with Dr. Bob Zybach. I hope you'll join us next week for part 2.
Thank you for joining us on Climate Debrief. Executive producer is Angela Wheeler. Producers, Ethan Audie and Scott Wheeler. You can find more episodes of Climate Debrief at co2coalition.org.